Welcome to today's podcast. My name is Pearlie Brewer, and I will be your host. Today's podcast guest is Robert LeBlanc. Robert is a health and safety consultant working here in New Brunswick. Welcome, Robert.
Hi, Pearlie. Thanks for having me.
Today we're going to have a little bit of a different podcast, and we're going to have more of a discussion around I guess you could say, the philosophical approaches to health and safety. I know myself, I've been in the business now for 30 some years, and over those years, I've seen a number of different approaches that organizations have tried. Everybody's constantly changing to see what new approaches they can apply and what works, what doesn't work, and so on. So Robert's agreed to join us today to talk about how things have changed in health and safety over the years. I guess the first question, Robert, how did you get involved in health and safety?
So Pearlie, it goes back to probably about 2009 when I very first started out, I guess, in any sort of adult lifehood. I'm only 37 years old. So my range of experience started as my initial career path was law enforcement. After progressing through that for about 4 years, I realized that my mental health and my social ability with everyday people had started to suffer. So the thought process came about where it's like, I really enjoyed the idea of public safety. So how could I transfer my focus from one side of things into a different industry? I met somebody that had helped me get into the field and started my journey through that process. My initial health and safety path started in Eastern Canada, which it then had taken me to multiple different provinces throughout the west coast of our country as well, and has evidently led me back home now to spend more time with my family.
Now, who have you worked with recently here in New Brunswick, just to give folks a bit of a perspective?
Yeah, sure. So currently right now I am consulting with MB Power down at Point Lepreau. I have worked with Morinville Mechanical. I've done some work with MRM to help out with them. I've aided with Irving Oil on outages. Cam, previously known as Worley, previously known as Jacobs. I've worked with them to help with outages, turnarounds, types of things like that. Yeah, so like Eastern companies, that would be it. I do some consulting services on the side, with my personal company, Spenyker Safety. So I work with One Stop Renovations, Black Fox Builders, just a couple of local construction companies throughout our neighborhoods.
Now, over the years, I've done quite a number of training sessions around our province, and gave me the opportunity to meet a wide variety of people. And it was always interesting when I had people in my audience who had been out west, who had worked out in the oil fields and in Alberta, and hear them and to get their perspective on what things were like out there versus what it was like back here. And when we talked before our podcast, one of the areas I'd like to discuss with you and get your perspective on is what have you seen in your experience working out west versus working east in the approaches the organizations take to health and safety?
Yeah, great question. So when I first started in the business, obviously, you know what you know, right? So coming from public safety, we were really driven towards that compliance aspect, and then switching into health and safety from the occupational side of things. When I started working on the East Coast, their methodology was kind of the only thing that I understood as to be what safety was. So I accepted that as the norm. Moving and then starting to work on the western part of our country, where I had worked in Syncrude, Suncor, Shell Albion, CNRL. I was a part of the LNG Canada project for the last almost 3 years prior to coming home this rotation. I noticed that their methodology was very, very different, and their approach seemed to be very different to me from what I was used to on the eastern part of our country, where they're very progressive. They're detail oriented, and they don't accept the fact that legislation is based around our minimum standards. So that's kind of what we need to work to. They're very interested in becoming the leader of the industry. They want to push the envelope and progress past what legislation says here. This is a guideline for the bare minimum of what you're required to do or what we would like to see you do. These guys really want to get above and beyond that, and they want to move past that. So to me, the approach was very progressive. I always found like we weren't just striving to meet the bare minimum of what legislation dictated we had to do. We were trying to set the new standard, right? Your gaps and everything that you would perform to do, we would take what industry leaders were doing at one point in time and we would say, how can we be better than this? We want to push forward. So I found that was like the key thing that stuck out to me, where my time and experience on the eastern side of the country was very compliance driven, where it was just like legislation says we got to do this. This is what we're going to do. The initial company that I went out and worked with on the West Coast is a company that's from Eastern Canada. So very quickly, you could imagine we were forced to adapt. We were forced to like, okay, this is the culture accepted norm out here. We really need to get in line with the boss type deal and see how we can adapt our values and move forward towards this kind of approach, as opposed to being relatively compliance driven for the past however many years I've been with them, right?
Now, a quick question here. If the company got the sense that, yeah, Robert's not really buying into our approach and you're questioning a lot of things, what did they do as a reaction to that?
It was difficult at first with that small company, especially when we left the eastern part of this country and we moved to the western part, and the approach was different, where it was like, I really need to help transition or shift the culture into this movement. So there was never any point in time where our heads clashed so much that we weren't able to come to consensus and I needed to part ways, or they thought I wasn't a good fit. It was a struggle at times, Burley, as you know, especially dealing with the project management side of things, and coming from a health and safety background, where we have this kind of progressive approach and we kind of have this outlook on how we see things needing to trend or needing to progress towards in order for the company to be successful. So there was lots of back and forth conversations. It really boils down to just getting into the room with these people and trying to see that we're here on the left, we need to be over here on the right, but the in-between doesn't really matter. We need to figure out how together collectively as a group we can achieve that end goal. So like I said, most of the time it was just sitting down, having those conversations, whether it was in an office setting or sitting at the pub having a beer, just kind of more in an informal setting to say like, look, like we clearly have these challenges that we need to face, and I'd like to see us do these together. If we can't fit, then by all means, I'm more than willing to move on and go my separate way. But I think that we could be successful if we work together.
So you worked out west, as you describe it, in organizations that were really sort of driven for best practices. Then you moved back east. What did you see when you moved back east?
So probably now that I've had the exposure that I've had, and since I've come home, I jumped in and did a quick outage this past fall. And like I said, now I'm down here with MB Power. I've noticed that over the years, from the time when I first started on the East Coast to the time that brought me back here now, we have made some positive steps. Like we have started to transition towards that kind of care approach opposed to the compliance. There still is some gaps there, I find. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of that has to do with, I don't want to say the quality, because that's not a fair term, but the workforce that we have here. Prior to now, everybody considers us now, this day and age, we're HSE professionals, right? Like, mm-hmm. So our industry as HSE professionals has started to grow, thanks to education and people that have put in the hard work and kind of moved towards that thing. And I credit a lot of it to like what's socially accepted norms nowadays. Like I said, the amount of education that we have and the younger generations that are starting to come into this field. There's a lot of people nowadays that are pursuing this field, right? Mm-hmm. So like we're we're not part of an organization. A lot of us weren't ex-tradespeople. We weren't injured on the job or didn't have a fit. And then an organization would say, okay, well, let's push them over into the health and safety department because the industry mandates that we have these people now. The large majority of the growth, to me, and in my opinion, has come from the fact that this younger generation and what has become socially accepted is really pushing the boundaries of what a health and safety professional is these days. It's developed a more progressive approach, and it's really started to push us towards this care model as opposed to this compliance model. And how can we be industry leading, right? Like, I'm a millennial. I'm 37 years old. I'm very much a part of that where it's like, I don't want to be the officer. I don't want to be the person that's out there constantly dictating this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. I don't like to focus on the negative. I have a very positive approach, and through the different companies that I've worked with and being exposed to those different atmospheres, we've been able to kind of grow that culture on the East Coast as well. We've started to make that shift also. I think one of the beauties of our industry is that if you want to work in this industry and you want to travel the world, the possibilities there for you, right? So you get exposed to so many different methodologies and so many different ways of doing things that it's very easy to start taking these little bits and pieces that work for you. And when you come back to wherever you're going to lay your head at night and you say, this is what I seen over my experience that kind of works the best, to whether you're trying to develop culture, whether you're trying to understand the behaviors that the workforce does. It's like human behavior is fascinating. So it's the more you try to understand, the more deep you get involved in it. So you can bring these things back from everywhere that you go, and you can really help drive forward to where at the end game is what everybody always has in their mind is like zero harm, no cost injuries, right? Like we want to get to the point where we don't have statistics other than good ones. Mm-hmm. So I find that being able to move around and transition and having this younger generation come in and really start to drive that sort of outlook has presented like great leaps and bounds for the health and safety side of things on the eastern part of this country. When I first started, dude, it was very compliance driven. Like I'd put my boots on at 7:30 in the morning. I'd go to toolbox. I'd go out in the field and walk around with the workers until first break. You'd come back, you'd go back out. And there was no time that you weren't out there really looking at what they were doing wrong. So like the only thing we were designed to do, and it's like, I don't fault it, because at that point in time, I think that's what the industry needed. We really needed that shift to auto-correct ourselves, where we were so focused on compliance that we kind of limited to the growth that the culture could see. The first 20 years of the industry recognized exponential growth. Well, it's because there was no benchmarking at that point in time, right? The mm-hmm. industry is what the industry was, and we didn't have anything to base what we were looking at on, because all we knew was that there were workplace injuries and we needed to be better. So how could we do this? Well, we needed to like these people were titled safety officers, and they went out there, and our job was to identify things that were wrong. That'll only take you so far. So being exposed to all these different routes now, the industry has come so far that we kind of hit like that lull period. And then now that the progressive approach has kind of been introduced and the more generations are coming in, there's more research, there's more education behind everything. We've really started to hurdle that fence, and we're now moving towards like, how can we be better? How can we push the envelope even further?
Yeah, when I hear you talk, Robert, a couple things come to mind. One, as far as your take on Western Canada and Eastern Canada, and the approaches used, when I ask people in my workshops, tell me what it was like out west, tell me what it was like here in the east. It was pretty much their reaction was the same as what you just said. Pretty much the same take. As to your comment about how things have changed and new blood, and that's been a big part. When I started in health and safety 30 to some years ago here in New Brunswick, very few people involved in health and safety. And yeah, some people might have called it the old boys club, but there just wasn't a whole lot of interest in health and safety back then, especially as a career. One of the things our podcast certainly has enjoyed this past year, we've had the opportunity to talk to a lot of what I'd call the younger people like yourself. We've had to talk to a number of women that are now getting involved in health and safety. A lot more women are involved in health and safety, and that's great because, going back 30 years ago, I don't know if I could think of maybe one or two that were involved. So, when you make your comment about a lot of new blood, a lot of new ideas, a lot of enthusiasm now coming out and coming into health and safety, it does make a big difference. And that enthusiasm in itself makes a huge difference. Now, you mentioned in one of the conversations we had before, a couple of people that you believe have had a pretty good influence on you. One was a gentleman I guess I hadn't heard of, Sidney Dekker.
Yep.
Tell me a little bit more about him.
So his methodology behind safety kind of coincides with Clive Lloyd. So the two of these gentlemen, I feel, are industry leading in our field. Clive Lloyd being a psychologist from Australia, and I believe Sidney Dekker's American. I hadn't gotten too far into his biography. The previous company that I worked with was Australian, so a lot of Clive Lloyd's methodology was kind of fed to us through that manner. But the two of them together, they operate side by side. Like, they have the same outlook, the same approach. Sidney Dekker's like most famously for his safety differently mindset. And Clive Lloyd is very focused on the whole direction between like the compliance to care model. So it all falls back on, we need to assume positive intent, versus negative intent. And for me, the easiest way to explain this to people, is there's a case study that was done, in Clive's book, where it talks about the safety walk versus the unsafety walk. So when somebody says, "Hey, we're going for a safety walk," what does that mean to you? Right? Like, if I asked you the question early and I said, "Let's go out for a safety walk," what's the objective of that walk? Right? So,
yeah. And traditionally it would be, who can we find not doing things right?
Exactly, right?
That's the old school approach.
Yeah, so that's assuming that negative intent. So when you read through this case study that they produce for you, it kind of breaks down and it paints a clear picture within that definition. It's like, we should be calling these things, if we were to take that old school approach, we should be calling them unsafety walks, because that's essentially what we're doing, right?
Yep.
We're going out there to pick out the negatives or to pick out the things that people are doing wrong, and we don't focus on the bigger picture, I guess. We don't look at the growth aspect that we could achieve if we went out there and assumed positive intent. So that safety differently mindset that he talks about really hits home, where we want to think about people as the solution, right? We don't want to think about our people as the problem, because they're not. 9 times out of 10, they're not the problem. They are the experts in their field when it comes down to it. A lot of us are not subject matter experts in everything that we kind of advise and review and guide on. We possess little bits and pieces of knowledge on the actual fundamentals that they're going to perform, and we can give them guidance on how to do that safely. Collaboration is the key point, right, to all of this, right? Without it, we don't learn and we don't grow. So Sydney's model of that safety differently hits those 3 points, which then it ties into Clive's aspect, where it comes into if you follow that negative intent model, you really put yourself into what he calls the trust loop or the fear loop. So if you're so focused on negative intent, you're going to establish a culture that lives in that fear loop, right? So that fear loop goes back to it. We've already said it, and it identifies the very first part of that. And it's we're focusing on our people as the problem, right? Like, the organization can't get any better because these people won't follow the rules. We're heavily focused on this compliance era. The only thing we do is we focus on the behaviors that these people portray, that they push out there, right? Well, what are the behaviors from, right? Like, we don't stop to look at that. We're only focused on the fact that it's a negative behavior, right? In quotations, it's a negative behavior. What does that do? It creates like a reward versus punish thing, where it's like you're constantly dangling a carrot for these people. More often than not, the reward is very minimal, or less seen, and it's more a punitive approach. Uh, that's so detrimental to the growth of a culture, because all it does is it puts people in a fear and extrinsic state and motivation, right? So it's like they don't want to do anything because they're afraid, but they don't want to not do anything because they're also afraid, right? Like, we still have a job to do, but I'm scared to do it this way because it might be wrong, type deal. What that does is it totally clams up our communication channels, right? The collaboration essentially dissipates at that point, and it becomes non-existent. By living in that fear loop, we've now created this, like, essential monster that won't allow our culture to grow, right? It doesn't allow the organization to learn, because we've now clammed up those communication channels, and we haven't been able to open the doors to say, how can we all learn as a team and push forward to grow, right? So by living in that assuming negative intent era, we live in that fear loop. And the idea behind Clive and Sydney, when he talks about safety differently and shifting from compliance to a care model, really gets you to live in the area that you want to live in, which is what he references as the trust loop. We look to the people as the solution, man. When we go out on these tours and we're doing a field walk, the first thing that comes to mind, if my eyes see something that I would be like, like, you get that feeling in your gut as a safety professional, you're like, I don't know if that's right, right? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but there's just something that seems off about it to me. My instant reaction isn't to go over there and say, hey, that's not right, stop that, right? My instant reaction is to go over and have that conversation with them, right? I want to focus on building the relationship with these people where they see me coming, and you don't get that typical response where the guys are like, oh man, here comes the safety guy, right? Like, we don't like that. And like, nobody likes that, right? Like, when you walk into a crowd of people or a group of workforce that are performing a task, and when they turn and see you coming and they smile and they want to have a conversation with you, that's a great feeling, right? We know that we've now made them understand that we treat them as the SMEs, and they are the solution to most of our problems. Like, we can find the answers amongst our people. We build the relationships, right? That inquiry travels back and forth, and it makes things very positive to work in. What does that do for us, right? That increases the trust between our level of position, whether it's management, health and safety consultant, it could be the CEO of a company, right? That trust is there because the people are comfortable, right? It allows for more learnings, right? Because, like I mentioned, we're not SMEs in every part of the field. So the more trust and the more communication channels I'm able to open with these guys, the more I learn myself. I'm able to understand processes better. I'm able to communicate more effectively if they have questions, because I understand what they're doing, right? What does that do for us, right? Like, so we're living in this trust loop. Where does it get us to? Well, it creates a high environment of psychological safety. So if we can get our culture to live in a psychological safety enriched environment, these things become second nature to them. We don't have those guys looking over their shoulder going, as soon as they see the safety guy, going, oh no, what am I doing wrong? Right? We cause them to second guess themselves by focusing on that negative intent. If we can live in the trust loop and they understand that they're the solution, we've built a relationship, they trust us, we've all learned together repeatedly, and we can prove that, their psychological safety is going to be at the next level. So when they're about to perform a task, they know, they're like, I'm doing this right, I'm doing that right, this is it, like, we're going in the right place. And when they do start to question things, they'll question the things themselves, right? So it's like, if they have a task to do that they're assigned with, their psychological safety is so high, they'll be going, no, there's something wrong with this. So we've now created a speak up culture, right? Where they'll approach us and say, hey, I don't think this is right. Could you help me come to a better conclusion or a better outcome on how we can do this? And then we truly live in that trust loop where the culture is just, it's never ending and it's constantly growing. And we've now shifted from that compliance model to a care model where, yes, we still achieve compliance. We still get the end result that we want. We want to be compliant with legislation. We don't want to be breaking any rules, but we've got there through a more positive approach as getting there through a negative and constantly beating them down, and clamming up the communication lines and really doing damage to the culture instead of getting growth like we want.
Now, it's great to hear you talk, Robert. You hit upon, I think, a lot of key points that have been brought up over the last year by different speakers in our podcast. Tim Peterson, CEO of WorkSafe, when he was here, he talked about collaboration. We've had 2 or 3 speakers talk about the psychological health and safety and what you need to do to create that. Really, I didn't need to ask questions. You've answered and brought up some really good points about as you put it, the new age approach to health and safety. Great approach. What kind of reaction have you been getting? You've worked for a couple of key employers, especially here in the province. What kind of feedback did you get from the employees? How are they buying into this?
It's actually been fairly good. And I think it kind of leads back to where we've seen growth in our industry, Pearly, with the new blood, to use your terminology, coming in. We're also getting that in, like, whether it's middle of the road or senior level management of these organizations now, where we're kind of shifting the tables here, right? So the younger generations are starting to come in, and the approach has been well receptive. But obviously there's times where it meets traction, right? Like, you're going to get that in every industry. And that's good, right? We want that. We don't always want to walk into the room and just have everybody listen to everything we say, because if we do, we're not doing ourselves any favor. We're not growing, right? You do need that little bit of traction to say, hey, like, are we doing the best that we can to do this? And for example, one of the companies that I worked with, I've consulted with them off and on for probably about 5 or 6 years. They're a great organization. They've always treated me very well. When I first started with them, I was working with a young project manager. So this young project manager had his mentor, who was essentially in the later parts of his career. It was always kind of the way that he did things. So we met a lot of resistance with my approach being so progressive, and I'm really trying to get them to understand, like, the shift towards this care model will really give us the growth that we need right now, and that we need to relax our focus on the entire compliance and the beatdown approach. It was a battle at first, and back and forth with me and him. It was hard to get him to see my perspective, and obviously my blinders were on because I felt so passionately about this care model that it was hard for me to see his side of things too. So we worked throughout the project, sometimes not so cohesively, but we did manage to have a successful project. I moved on and started working with another company, but then I recently came back and ended up working with this fella again. And the more exposure, I guess, that he has had to this new model of safety, whether you want to call it safety to, safety differently, compliance to care, however you want to title it. We had a good chat after one of our first meetings that I had, because he was that project manager that gave every safety professional that feeling when they walked in at one point in time, that was like, I'm a cost burden to him. I'm more of a hindrance than I am of a help, right? So every safety professional in their career has felt that at some point in time.
Yeah,
when exactly, right? So after this meeting that I had, after coming back and working with him again, I asked him if he could stick behind. He gladly complied. He said, yeah, sure. Let's have a chat. And I said, I just want to commend you on your growth. I said, like, this is one of the first times I've been in a meeting, with you, and I was a benefit. Like, I felt like a benefit. Like, you incorporated us in planning. Like, we were involved right from the start, like through planning, through execution. Like, the idea was to encompass safety from start to finish, which at the end of the day, that's all we've really been trying to do, right? If you involve us from the start of the process to the end of the process, we're going to be successful as a team. It was very hard to get him to do that initially. And then he said, you know what, dude? He goes, honestly, it was the same company that I worked with that I was having this conversation with him that I initially went to the West Coast with and started working out there with. So he said after his fellow peers had came back from that project and they started talking about this approach, right? And it's like, we really focus on building the relationships now. We're not so focused on this compliance act. I'm not looking to you like it's a burden. We're really starting to look towards like how we can shift to a more progressive approach. He goes, I know you had been telling me for years prior to, he goes, but it took the rest of them to bring that information back to really help me get to the place that I'm at today. And he goes, by all means, I'm not perfect. He goes, but we will work together to try to get there. And I found that that has really been positive for me, because that growth is coming, right? And it's showing us that shift in middle management and upper management has really started to take place too, because if you want to talk about culture, the first thing that you need to lead to is the company's values, right? So what is the company's values? Why are we doing what we're doing, right? If every part of the organization doesn't fully believe in those values and understand the why of the company, it's going to be impossible to not have roadblocks, right? Yes, we're going to have bumps and bruises along the way, but at the end of the day, the values and the understanding of why, that should be the focus, right? If they have the values that mean like we believe in our people, we focus on growth, we're trying to like deliver the best product that we can for our client. If those are the company's values, at every level of management or leadership, we need these people to understand these values, and they need to become their why as well, right? In order for them to understand and actually believe in what the focus of the company is, they need to possess them values themselves. If they don't, we won't be able to push those boundaries and to move forward and to grow the culture in the direction that we want to grow in. And it was delightful to see that he had recognized that and he had made that shift internally, right? Which was awesome.
Look, Robert, I could stay here all day and listen to you talk about what you're doing in health and safety and the new modern age approach. Unfortunately, our podcast has sort of hit its time limit. It's really nice to hear someone with fresh attitude, with a new approach, the care model. It's nice always to feature some of the younger blood, that as I call it, new people getting into health and safety. And sometimes I'm an older gentleman, and sometimes we hear people say, well, what kind of hands are we leaving a topic in? And in your case, and I listen to you and others. I think our future in health and safety here in our province is going to be well looked after. We've got a lot of folks like yourself that I believe are going to contribute a lot to the new age thinking. And certainly to hear you talk today with your enthusiasm and your approach, keep up the good work, I guess is all I could really add to it. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
Yes, I appreciate it, Pearlie.
Very much appreciate you taking the time today, and we'll probably have you back at some point in the future to continue our discussion. It's obviously a discussion could last quite a while, but certainly keep up the good work you're doing. And for our podcast listeners, I'm sure they've enjoyed today's podcast. We'd love to hear from you. If you have any comments you'd like to make, you can send them to podcast@ssnv.ca. Again, thank you, Robert, and everyone, take care. Have a safe week. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, Pearlie.